before we begin tonight's story, welcome to No Name, the channel where real RV camping turns into something far stranger, and the quiet places of America reveal what they've been hiding all along. If you love true inspired horror from campgrounds, deserts, forests, and everywhere in between, make sure you're subscribed. And if tonight's story leaves your mind turning long after the final sentence, drop a comment and tell us what you think really happened out there. Now settle in, turn the lights low, and let's step back into the dark. I don't think anything truly prepares you for the kind of silence that makes your heartbeat feel like an intruder. My name is Elias Grant. I'm 40 years old, and in July of 2022, I set out alone to dry camp near Goblin Valley State Park in Utah. I'd been RV camping for over a decade, long enough to understand the land, the rhythm of the desert, and the weight of solitude. But until that week, I'd never felt the land watching me back. I'd never felt the night leaning in as if it wanted something from me. I chose Goblin Valley because it had always fascinated me. The hoodoos rise like frozen figures mid-conversation, shaped by wind, sand, and time. They're beautiful in the daylight, sure, but the truth is, they become something else after dark. Something older, something that remembers things you and I shouldn't know. And I didn't go there entirely for peace. I went because I was running away from a summer that felt too loud, too fast-paced, too full of people who needed things from me. I wanted to be unreachable for a few days. Completely off-grid. No generators nearby, no camp neighbors, no trail chatter, just me in the desert. But when you strip everything away, when you're alone with a landscape that doesn't care if you exist, the mind starts hearing things it normally ignores. The first evening was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The air was still, heavy with heat, even as the sun dipped behind the rock formations. I parked my old Volkswagen-based Class B RV in a spot where the sandstone towers framed the skyline like jagged teeth. The colors bled from orange to violet to a deep, smothering blue as night settled in. It was the kind of sky that doesn't twinkle, just stares. I made a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and walked along the edge of the rock formations, feeling the desert breathe. Everything seemed peaceful, perfect, exactly what I needed. But then the wind died completely. No movement, no rustle, no animal sounds, just that thick desert silence that feels like it's pressing against your eardrums. And that's when I heard it. A slow, rhythmic drumming. It wasn't loud, not at first, just a faint, hollow thump, then another, like someone striking a wooden bowl with the flat of their hand. A steady pattern, deliberate, not echoing like something far away, not random like an animal knocking loose stones down a slope. No, this had cadence. I froze where I stood. My first instinct was to rationalize it. Someone hiking nearby, another camper I hadn't noticed, a vehicle backfiring in the distance. But the nearest dispersed sight was miles away. And the sound didn't travel like anything mechanical. It felt close, too close. I turned slowly, scanning the strange rock shapes. Goblin Valley is full of formations that look eerily like people, some hunched, some watching, some frozen mid-step. In the dark, the shapes blend together. Your eyes invent faces where none exist. Your mind completes silhouettes that aren't human. The drumming stopped as soon as I moved. I stayed standing there, breathing shallow, ears straining, telling myself I was imagining it. Maybe the heat had messed with my senses. Maybe I was projecting tension onto a place that was just itself. But then it came again. 3 beats this time. Slow, measured, confident. I backed away from the rocks and retreated to my RV. I didn't run, but I walked faster than I care to admit. Once inside, I locked the door, a habit I never really bothered with in the desert, and sat on the edge of the bed, listening. Nothing. No drumming. No wind. No insects. The silence felt so complete it almost vibrated. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept circling the sound. The pattern of it replayed over and over in my head through the night until I wasn't sure if I'd dreamed it or remembered it. Around 2 a.m., I finally drifted off. At 3:17 a.m., I woke up to the RV shaking. Not violently, just a subtle rocking, the way it might if someone pressed a shoulder against the side and leaned their weight slowly into it. My eyes flew open. My breath caught in my throat. There was no wind outside, and the shake came again. I sat perfectly still, sweat forming on my forehead, even though the desert night had turned cold. Instinct told me not to move. Not yet. Not until I understood what was happening. Another shift. A steady pressure, pushing against the vehicle, holding for a moment, then releasing. I reached slowly for the flashlight near my pillow and clicked it off instead of on, realizing too late that light would make me visible but wouldn't help me see anything through the tinted window. Then I heard it. The drumming. Soft, muffled, right outside my RV. 4 beats this time. Slow, deliberate, like someone testing the acoustics of my metal walls. I felt my throat tighten. A part of me wanted to yell. Another part wanted to fling the door open and confront whoever was out there. But neither instinct won. Instead, I stayed completely still, muscles locked, breathing controlled. I leaned as quietly as I could toward the small side window above the kitchenette and peeked through the corner where the blind didn't fully meet the frame. At first, I saw nothing, just the ghostly outlines of the hoodoos under the moonlight. Then something moved. Not a person, not an animal, a shape, low to the ground, almost crawling, but not quite. It shifted between 2 boulders, then froze as if listening. The outline was wrong. Too long in the limbs, too narrow in the torso, like something stretched by time or hunger or both. My breath caught so sharply I thought the sound would give me away. The shape leaned its head upward. Even from that distance, even through the dim light, I knew. It wasn't human. Or if it wasn't anymore. I stumbled backward, my shoulder hitting the cabinet with a dull thud. The drumming stopped instantly. The desert air outside felt like it had become aware of me. The silence pulsed. Then, footsteps. Slow. Approaching. I held my breath until my vision blurred. The steps grew closer, crunching lightly on the sand. My mind raced for explanations, a trick of shadows, dehydration, sleep paralysis, anything that didn't involve what I thought I'd seen. But then something slid downward across the outside of the RV wall. A dragging sound, like fingers tracing the metal. I pressed myself against the interior wall, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. Every instinct told me to stay quiet, not to provoke whatever was outside. Another drag, another slow, deliberate stroke along the metal. Then a sound that nearly broke me. A soft exhale, right outside the window. Human-like, but wrong. Too dry, too raspy, like air forced through a throat that hadn't spoken in years. Without thinking, I reached up and slapped my hand against the ceiling light switch. The RV flooded with brightness. Blinding, artificial, broad. The dragging stopped instantly. The footsteps retreated. Fast, uneven. I lunged for the front window, but saw nothing. Just the desert, empty and still, the hoodoos rising like silent witnesses. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn finally came, I stepped outside with the kind of dread that settles in your bones. My boots left prints in the sand. So did something else. Not footprints, handprints. Dozens of them. As if something had crawled around the RV on all fours, circling it, studying it. The tracks led toward the rocks and then disappeared. I packed up faster than I ever have in my life. But as I did, I noticed something that made my stomach sink. On the passenger door of my RV, in the dust, someone or something had drawn 3 small circles, arranged in a triangle, perfectly even, deliberate, a mark, a message, or a warning. I drove out of that desert with a sense of urgency I've never felt. Even miles away, the drumming pattern replayed in my head as if echoing from inside me. For weeks after returning home, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Sleep deprivation, hallucination, tricks of light. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shape between the rocks, its movements, its head turning toward me. I knew what I felt that night. The land wasn't empty. It wasn't indifferent. Something old was in those rocks, something that watches and listens and waits. And when the desert goes silent, truly silent, you should never ignore it, because silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the moment before something begins. And in Goblin Valley, that something begins with a drum beat, a slow, patient rhythm, one you feel in your bones long after you escape it, one that reminds you some places aren't meant to be camped alone, Some places remember you, and some things out there still know your name. I didn't understand the weight of silence until the night it began, pressing against the walls of my RV like a living thing, waiting, patient, and unbearably close. My name is Marcus Hale, 40 years old, born and raised in northern Iowa, and I've been camping long enough to know when a place feels wrong. But in May of 2020, after months of being cooped up in my small apartment, I convinced myself that a quiet solo trip to Minnesota's Boundary Waters would reset my mind. I told myself solitude would be good, healing, even. I didn't realize that sometimes the quietest places are the ones where something is listening. I rolled into the access point on a Tuesday evening, just before dusk. The sun was sinking behind the tree line, smearing warm orange across the surface of the lake. Water so still it looked like polished glass. Pines rising on all sides like the ribs of a vast, ancient creature. It should have felt peaceful, but there was a heaviness in the air I couldn't name, the kind that makes your instincts tug at your shirt like a child begging you not to go farther. But I ignored it. I always ignore that first whisper of unease, chalk it up to overthinking, to being alone, to the world being too quiet. I wish I hadn't. I parked my old white Volkswagen RV, a 78 I'd restored myself, near the shoreline where the access road widened out into a clearing. A few other sites were open, but no one else had set up for the night. Not a single tent. No canoes tied off. Nothing. That was the first thing that bothered me. The Boundary Waters in May usually draws at least a few early paddlers. The emptiness felt unnatural, like everyone had decided at once that this wasn't the weekend to be here. Still, I stepped out, breathing in the crisp spring air, trying to shake the tightness in my chest. The lake wasn't frozen anymore, but it held that cold, metallic smell that sneaks under your clothes. I felt it settle behind my ribs. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I set up camp. I heated dinner. I walked the shoreline with my flashlight, each step squelched in the damp ground, echoing brighter than it should have. The entire forest seemed to lean in, listening. When darkness finally fell, it fell fast. One moment the sky still held a smear of blue, and the next it had collapsed into pitch. I climbed into the RV, locked the door out of habit, and sat at the small table, listening to the soft tick of cooling metal. I told myself it would get easier once I slept. But I didn't sleep, because the first sound came just after midnight, a single light tap against the side of the RV. Not a branch, not an animal, too deliberate, tap. Then nothing. The kind of nothing that forces your breath to stay stuck in your throat, because you're suddenly aware of the thinness of the walls around you, the fragility of your own quiet heartbeat. I waited, listening. I even held my breath. But the forest returned to silence, as if mocking me for being startled. I whispered to myself that it was probably something falling from a tree. A pine cone, maybe. A snapping twig. My mind scanned through every logical explanation, and I chose the one that let me stay calm. Until 5 minutes later, when it happened again. Tap. A little louder. A little closer to the window. I felt my skin tighten across my shoulders. This time I stood, moving slowly, careful not to let the floor creak. The Volkswagen RV wasn't big, but walking through it in that darkness felt like crossing an entire home. Each step a reminder that I was alone, truly, undeniably alone. I eased the blinds open just half an inch. Nothing, only blackness. The lake a void, the tree line a jagged silhouette. But the absence of anything was worse, because the tapping had been real, and something had made it. I let the blinds drop back into place and stepped away from the window. My mind began doing that thing it does when fear swells too fast, telling me I was misinterpreting everything. That maybe my nerves were heightened, maybe I'd kicked something earlier that had shifted and fallen, maybe I'd imagined it. But then came the third sound. This one wasn't a tap. It was a slow, dragging scrape along the lower half of the RV's exterior, like fingertips or claws, tracing the metal. I felt every inch of it vibrate through the floor, up through my feet. I froze in place, my breath shallow, my hands suddenly damp. I whispered into the darkness, "Who's out there?" It was stupid. My voice sounded small, too hopeful for an answer I wasn't sure I wanted, and yet the scrape stopped immediately, as if whatever was outside had been waiting for me to speak. For 10 seconds I didn't move, didn't think, didn't blink. Then something pressed faintly against the back window. Not knocking, not scratching, pressing. A shape, a form. Distorting the curtain just enough that I could see the fabric bulge inward by half an inch. I stumbled backward, my calf hitting the bench seat. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it pulsing in my ears. The curtain held that unnatural curve for a full second, 2 seconds, 3. Then it released. Silence swallowed the RV again, but the silence wasn't empty now. It was loaded, waiting. I backed toward the driver's seat, debating whether to start the engine, but the idea of turning on the RV, of making noise, of drawing attention to myself, something in me refused. The fear wasn't panic yet, it was dread. Heavy, suffocating dread that told me whatever was outside was observing. Curious, patient. I sat there for what felt like an hour, though it was probably 10 minutes, listening for footsteps on the gravel, a voice, anything. Instead, the next sound came from the lake, a splash, loud enough to be from something big. Not a fish, not a bird diving, something entering the water. I forced myself to peek through the front windshield. Nothing, only faint moonlight cutting a pale streak across the lake's surface. Then slowly, something darker than the water itself rose near the far shore. A shape, broad, vaguely hunched, unmoving, like a silhouette carved out of night. I leaned forward, trying to make sense of it. Trees were behind it, but the thing stood closer to the water, too close, in a spot without any visible path. It didn't move. I felt my throat close, the air in the RV suddenly thick, hard to swallow. The shape shifted, just slightly, and that was enough to confirm it wasn't a tree. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't anything that belonged on that shoreline. Then it stepped forward, one slow, deliberate step, its outline growing clearer against the moonlit water. I pulled away from the windshield so fast I knocked over my thermos. The metallic clang exploded through the quiet, echoing around me, and outside, out there, something reacted. Because I heard it, a single low exhale, wet, heavy, almost tired. My breath caught, my skin crawled. I crouched low, sinking behind the table, the RV suddenly feeling too bright, too exposed. The moonlight leaking through the curtains felt like it painted a target on me. For 5 minutes, I didn't move at all, but the shape on the shoreline did. Slowly, deliberately. Each movement unhurried, as if it knew there was no reason to rush. It stepped into the shallow water, disturbing that perfect mirror-like surface. Ripples glimmered faintly. I could hear the faint splash from all the way across the lake. Another step, then another. Coming closer, and closer, and closer. My heart was a trapped bird slamming against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but where? Into the forest? Into the water? Staying inside the RV felt like being trapped in the thinnest shell in the world. I edged toward the driver's seat, crawling so I wouldn't be seen through the windows. My fingers shook as I reached for the keys. I didn't want to start the engine, not yet, but I wanted to be ready. Then I heard it, the shallow slosh of water directly in front of the RV. The lake was maybe 40 feet away. It was here, right outside. I held my breath until my chest burned. My hands clutched the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. Something shuffled on the gravel, slow, wet, dragging. Then a soft knock on the hood, not loud, not angry. A test, a gesture, a confirmation that I was inside. I felt tears sting unexpectedly at the back of my eyes, not from sadness, but from the primal terror curling through my spine. The knock came again. Then a slow brush across the metal, like a palm dragging over it. I don't know what finally broke inside me. My instincts, my fear, my sense of self-preservation, all of it collided at once. I turned the key. The engine roared to life, headlights blasting the clearing in harsh yellow light. And there, just feet from the front bumper, stood the thing. A towering figure, dripping lake water, its outline impossibly wrong. Not quite human, not quite animal. Its face hidden in shadow, but I swear, God, I swear, I saw the faint glint of eyes reflecting the headlights. Not round like a deer, not wide like a bear, focused, unblinking, watching me. I slammed the RV into reverse so hard the transmission jolted. Gravel sprayed behind me as I swung the vehicle around, nearly clipping a pine tree. My hands trembled, fighting the wheel, but adrenaline pushed me through. The creature didn't move at first, just stood there, head tilted slightly. Then, slowly, it stepped forward into the beam of the headlights, and I saw its shoulders rise with a breath. I floored the accelerator. The RV fishtailed, tires skidding on loose gravel, but I didn't care. I kept my foot down, eyes locked on the narrow road ahead. Branches whipped the sides of the vehicle, but I didn't dare slow down. Only when I reached the paved highway did I finally let myself breathe. One long, shuddering exhale that felt like it emptied everything inside me. But even miles away from the lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed. That something had seen me and remembered me. When I finally stopped at a gas station hours later, my hands were still shaking. I stepped out into the fluorescent light, and for a moment the world felt normal again. Cars, people, music playing inside, but there, on the front hood of my RV, a single wet handprint. Too big, too long-fingered, too real. I stared at it until my chest felt hollow. That night taught me something I've never forgotten. Silence isn't empty. The wilderness isn't empty. And sometimes when you go seeking peace in the most remote places, something there is already waiting. Something patient, something curious. Something that steps out from the lake when the world sleeps. And once it's seen you, it never forgets. I've always believed that fear has a sound. Sometimes it's the sharp crack of a breaking branch. Sometimes it's the low moan of wind dragging itself across open land. But on the night my family and I camped at Snake River Canyon, fear revealed itself as footsteps, fast, frantic footsteps pounding across loose gravel, as if someone were running straight toward our RV, just out of sight, just beyond the beam of our porch light, just close enough for me to feel the ground tremble beneath my boots. My name is Mark Callister. I'm 44 years old, and I've been RV camping across the western United States for more than half my life. I've always prided myself on being the kind of man who knows the land, its moods, its warnings, its quiet grace. I grew up in Lewiston, Idaho, fishing the riverbanks before the sun came up and learning very early that nature doesn't make promises. The canyon especially, it carries a reputation older than any campground map or tourism brochure. Locals whisper about strange echoes, distant screams that rebound across the basalt walls, lights that crawl along the cliffs like living things. I've heard the stories since childhood, but like most people who grew up in places with old folklore, I brushed them aside until December 2023. Until the night something ran toward our RV in the freezing dark, again and again, even though, by every logical measure, there was no one out there at all. The trip was my idea. My wife, Lena, had been begging for one last winter outing before the holidays swallowed our time. Our daughter, 9-year-old Ellie, was thrilled just to be near snow. I wanted to give them the kind of adventure my father used to give me, one more memory to layer into the family story. The drive to the canyon was long and mostly quiet, the landscape stripped down to bone and shadow by the season. Bare branches scraped at the sky, the river below flowing thick and slow, carrying the weight of winter. We set up at a small, primitive site perched above the canyon floor. There were only 2 other RVs there, both older rigs that looked like they'd been parked for days. No movement, no lights, no tire tracks that looked recent. It felt like we'd arrived in a place that had been waiting for us, holding its breath. That first evening was calm, almost soothing. Lena made hot chocolate inside while I ran through a quick check around the RV. Stabilizers locked, hoses insulated, propane levels good. The cold bit at my cheeks, but the canyon air had that purity I always chase when we camp. Crisp, fragrant with juniper, carrying the faint mineral scent of the river below. By the time darkness settled, we were all tucked in, warm, ready for an early night. But around 11:30 p.m., something woke me. I didn't sit up suddenly or jolt awake in a dramatic way. It was quieter than that. Just a feeling first. A shift in the air pressure, a subtle drag of silence that didn't feel normal. The kind of silence that feels engineered, intentional, like something is listening. Then I heard it. A single crunch outside the RV. At first I thought it was just a deer or maybe a stray raccoon, something rooting around the site. The gravel was cold and hard, and small animals always made it sound louder than it really was. But a second crunch followed. Then a third. Slow. Measured. Heavy enough that I felt it through the floor. These weren't animal steps. I slid quietly from the bed, careful not to wake Lena or Ellie. I pressed my ear to the door, and the sound sharpened, gravel shifting beneath weight. One step, pause, another. As if whoever was out there was studying the RV, circling it. I grabbed my flashlight, cracked the door, and stepped outside. The cold hit me so hard my breath caught. The beam from my flashlight carved a white arc across the campsite, slicing through the frost-coated ground, the picnic table, the fire pit we hadn't bothered to use. Nothing. No shapes, no shadows moving where they shouldn't. But the feeling, that feeling of being watched, took root in my spine and crawled upward like ice. I told myself to calm down. The wind between the canyon walls can create illusions, sound ricocheting, forming phantom footsteps. I'd heard it before in different places, but as I scanned the darkness, I spotted something that made my stomach compress. Footprints. Clear, fresh footprints in the gravel leading toward the RV from the tree line. Boots, not bare feet. Not animal tracks. And they stopped right at the edge of the light and didn't lead back. I backed into the RV and locked the door. I didn't sleep much after that, drifting in and out, listening for more movement. At some point, I convinced myself it had been a hiker or a hunter passing through, curious maybe, or confused in the dark. That explanation settled me enough to rest. But the next night shattered any comfort that logic offered. We'd spent the day hiking along one of the canyon overlooks, taking pictures, breathing in the cold air. Everything felt normal, even peaceful. By sunset, the canyon glowed orange and gold, and for a moment I forgot the footsteps entirely. But around 1 a.m., they returned. Only this time, they were running. It started faint, a distant pattering on gravel like someone sprinting from the far end of the campground. I sat up immediately, pulse quickening. The sound grew louder, sharper, hitting the ground in rapid, heavy slaps. Someone was sprinting toward our RV, not jogging, not stumbling, running. I froze. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The footsteps grew louder, closer, fast enough that they began to rattle loose items inside the cabinets. Ellie stirred in her sleep. Lena whispered my name, fear already tightening her voice. The runner reached the outside of the RV, and the steps stopped so suddenly I flinched. I waited for a knock, a shadow, a scream, something. Nothing came, just thick silence pressing against the walls. I crept to the door again, flashlight trembling in my grip. I hesitated, remembering the stories my father used to tell about people going missing in the canyon, about things that called you out, lured you away. But I had a family in the RV behind me. I had to know. I opened the door. The cold slapped me again, but I forced myself forward. I swept the light across the site. No one. No movement. But the footprints, the footprints, were everywhere. Deep, chaotic impressions circling our RV in wild loops as if someone had been running full speed in circles around us. But the strangest detail wasn't the pattern. It was the depth. Some were so deep they looked like they'd been made by someone weighing 3 times what a human should. And the spacing was wrong. Too long between each step, like whatever ran those circles wasn't moving naturally. A sharp sound cracked from behind me, and I whipped the light toward one of the abandoned RVs down the hill. The door was open now, wide open. I could have sworn it had been shut when we arrived. I took a step toward it. The air changed. A sudden, invisible pressure washed over me, like stepping into water, like being watched by something with invisible hands hovering inches from my throat. A scent drifted by, faint but foul, like wet stone mixed with decay. and then a whisper, not from a direction I could identify, just around me. Go back. My body reacted before my mind did. I ran. I slammed back into the RV, locked everything, closed the curtains. Lena was already holding Ellie, who had woken crying without knowing why. I told them we were leaving at first light. Neither questioned me, neither slept. But the footsteps didn't stop. 3 more times before sunrise, we heard them, first slow and deliberate, then running again, circling us, pausing, then sprinting away. Each time I reached for a weapon I didn't pack, a certainty building inside me that whoever or whatever was out there wasn't interested in entering the RV. It wanted us to exit. It wanted to lure us outside. At dawn, exhausted and shaking, I stepped out again to check the site before we left. The footprints were still there, dozens of them. But in the pale morning light, I noticed something I hadn't the night before. Each print was filled with water, perfectly filled, as if placed there deliberately, as if something had moved through the gravel without disturbing the frost or the surrounding ground, just stamping those deep impressions and leaving everything else untouched. I followed the trail toward the tree line, only far enough to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind, but the tracks didn't lead into the trees. They stopped abruptly at the edge of the brush, the last few prints fanning outward in a strange arc, as if the runner had launched forward and vanished. I felt a weight in my chest then, a quiet understanding that not everything in the canyon belonged to the world I knew. Not everything that walked made sense or left trails the way we did. The air in that patch of forest felt wrong, humming with a low vibration I could feel in my teeth. We left within 10 minutes. The further we drove from the canyon, the lighter my body felt, like something had been peeled off my skin. But even miles away, when I looked into the rearview mirror, I half expected to see someone running behind us, closing the distance on gravel that wasn't there. I've replayed that night more times than I can count. I've tried to rationalize it, break it apart, understand it like a man should understand the world around him. But I can't. And maybe that's the lesson Snake River Canyon carved into me. That some places in America still belong to the dark, still carry echoes older than our maps, older than our memories. I learned that trusting my instincts is not weakness, it's survival. That when the land shifts, when the air changes, when the quiet becomes too perfect, it's not paranoia, it's a warning. And sometimes the smartest thing you can do is leave before the footsteps reach your door. Because fear has a sound, and once you hear it running toward you across the gravel, you never forget it. I've learned that some places don't need shadows or monsters to feel dangerous. Sometimes the land itself carries a pulse you aren't meant to touch. And the night I camped along the edge of the Shasta Trinity National Forest, I felt that pulse the moment the sun dipped behind the ridgeline. I didn't know it then, but the forest was already watching me, listening with a kind of patient hunger that only shows its teeth when you're completely alone. My name is Reed Halverson. I'm 42 years old, born and raised on the outskirts of Sacramento, and I've been taking solo RV trips since I was 21. Camping has always been my release valve, my way of stepping out of the noise of my life, especially after a year that had felt like one long, unraveling thread. I'd taken this October trip to clear my head, to get some distance from a job that had drained me dry and a relationship that had ended in a way I still didn't have words for. I needed quiet. I needed the openness of the mountains. I needed a place where nothing demanded anything from me. But the forest around Shasta doesn't give you peace. Not really. It gives you silence. A heavy, stretched thin silence that winds itself into your ears and settles in your bones. And on that first evening, as I parked my old Volkswagen Westfalia near an overlook that faced the ridgeline, that silence felt almost medicinal. I remember stepping out and breathing in the cold air, believing this trip would be the one that reset everything. I didn't yet understand that the forest gives silence only so it can hear you better. Even before twilight finished settling, something felt off. Not wrong, not threatening, just aligned strangely, like the world had shifted a few degrees, but I was the only one who noticed. The pine needles didn't rustle, the air didn't move. Even the warm orange fade of the sunset felt muted, like looking at it through glass. I told myself I was imagining it. I'd been tired, strung out, overthinking everything in my life lately. The forest wasn't strange. I was. But unease has a way of whispering the truth long before you can say it out loud. I cooked a simple dinner on my small propane stove, set up my fold-out chair, and tried to relax. I could see the faint outline of Mount Shasta far in the distance, its peak glowing like it stored its own cold light. The ridgeline in front of me cut a jagged silhouette against the sky. For a moment, I actually felt grateful, like maybe I'd chosen the perfect place to reset. Then the first sound drifted across the ridge, a long, low moan, somewhere between a wind gust and an animal cry, but stretched too evenly, too deliberately. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it didn't belong to anything I'd ever heard in the woods before. It carried a tone that almost sounded shaped, like someone sliding their voice against the grain of a word that wouldn't form. I froze in my chair, the hair on my arms lifted all at once. Mountain lion? Maybe, but it didn't rumble low enough. Elk? No, this sound had no breath to it. Wind through a canyon? There was no wind. I listened, but it didn't repeat. And the silence afterward was deeper than before, thick like it had weight. I let out a nervous laugh. I told myself not to be ridiculous. I'd spent my whole life hiking, camping, navigating remote backcountry trails alone. I knew the woods. I trusted them. And Shasta was full of stories, full of myths, full of people looking for meaning where there was only nature doing what nature does. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Night fell quickly. The temperature dropped hard. I climbed into the van, zipped up in my sleeping bag, and tried to settle. But my mind kept circling back to that sound, its shape, its rhythm, the strange restraint in it. It hadn't sounded like distress or aggression. It had sounded curious. Around midnight, I woke up without knowing why. No noise, no movement, just that prickling sensation that something in the dark had shifted. I lay still, listening. The van creaked softly as the cold tightened the frame. I breathed through my nose, slow and quiet. For a moment, I felt silly, hyper-aware from being alone, letting my imagination replay that earlier sound on loop. Then, from somewhere near the ridge, a single click echoed across the forest. Not a branch snapping, not a rock falling, a soft, deliberate click, like two stones tapped together. I pushed myself up on my elbows, another click, and another. Each one spaced apart by several seconds, irregular but intentional. I strained to place the direction. It wasn't coming from the ground level or the tree line. It was coming from higher up, from somewhere along the ridge itself. Then the clicking stopped. I waited, barely breathing. 7, maybe 8 seconds of nothing. Then that same low moan rolled through the trees, longer this time, and closer, much closer. My chest tightened. There was no mistaking it now. That sound had purpose. It didn't carry like an animal call. It didn't resonate naturally. It felt directed. A flashlight felt suddenly inadequate. But I grabbed mine anyway, stepped out of the van, and pointed it toward the ridge. The beam hit the treetops first, motionless. Then the slope, bare. Then the near-ground brush, nothing. The forest looked exactly as it should look at midnight. Still, empty, indifferent. But the air felt wrong again. Thicker. Like something had stepped into the night with me and hadn't bothered to hide its presence. I told myself not to panic. Not yet. I'd always been rational, always been steady. Fear is manageable when you give it something structured to hold on to. So I stepped back into the van, shut the door gently, and sat in the dark with only the faint red glow of my battery meter. I tried to reason with myself. Probably rocks slipping from the ridge, probably some distant animal echoing strangely in the valley, probably nothing at all. But the human mind knows when it's lying to itself. Around 1:30 a.m., the clicking returned. This time it came from 2 places at once, both high on the ridge and low near the tree lines, that like something had split into 2 or something else had joined it. 2 clicks on the ridge. A pause. One click closer to camp. Silence. Then a long, breathless moan that made the metal frame of the van shiver. My pulse hammered in my throat. The forest no longer felt indifferent. It felt attentive, like the silence itself was leaning forward to listen. I pressed my back against the van wall and closed my eyes, telling myself not to spiral, not to let old anxieties rise. Not after the year I'd had, not after everything had already been stripped away from me. I needed this trip to work. I needed it to give something back to me, not take something more. But fear doesn't negotiate. The clicking grew louder, closer, more precise. Then something scraped across the outside of the van. Just once, a slow, dragging scrape along the driver's side panel. Too long to be a branch, too clean to be an animal brushing past. It sounded like something rigid trailing lightly across the metal, almost testing it. I snapped on my flashlight and pointed it out the window. Nothing. No shape, no movement, not even dust stirred, just the ridge staring back at me in its silent, jagged outline. I felt the first real tremor of panic then, not from the sound, but from the realization that it wasn't behaving like any creature I knew. Animals don't test boundaries. Animals don't coordinate sounds. And animals sure as hell don't circle silently and then drag something across your vehicle just to see what you'll do. My breathing turned shallow. Sweat chilled on my back. And for the first time, I wondered if I had made a mistake coming out here alone. The scrape didn't repeat. The clicking stopped. The moaning fell away. The forest returned to stillness, as if whatever had been there simply withdrew once it knew I was awake. But silence can be more terrifying than noise. Hours passed like that, me sitting upright, flashlight in hand, waiting for the next sound, the next scrape, the next signal from the ridge, but nothing came. Dawn finally crept in, slow streaks of gray and gold across the horizon, and for a moment I convinced myself that everything I'd heard had been some strange atmospheric echo, until I stepped outside. On the driver's side, along the exact line where I'd heard the scrape, 4 narrow, perfectly parallel lines ran across the metal, not deep, not jagged, but straight, deliberate, evenly spaced, like something with a rigid 4-pronged edge had traced a gentle path just to see how the van would respond. My stomach dropped. Whatever had been out there in the dark, it had touched the van on purpose. I stared at those marks for what felt like hours, my hands trembling, even as the sun began to warm the cold metal of the van. Every rational thought I tried to grasp slipped away. This wasn't a trick of light or a branch or my imagination. The forest had left its signature, and it wasn't subtle. I packed quickly, my hands shaking as I secured everything inside the van. Every instinct screamed to leave, to drive down the ridge line and never look back. And yet, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to linger, to see if the ridge, the forest, would give another signal, another sound, a final answer to the question I didn't even fully understand. That was the mistake. The curiosity that always followed me into the woods. I started the engine, and the roar of the van felt almost obscene in the thick, heavy morning. I rolled backward slowly, eyes flicking constantly to the tree line. Everything seemed ordinary in the daylight. The forest had shed its night cloak, returned to the mundane business of trees, wind, and distant birds. But I knew better. The marks, the clicks, the moan, they were proof that the forest had been awake while I slept, that it had been observing me, testing me. As I drove down the ridge road, the first real sunlight cutting into my eyes, I felt the weight of it lift slightly, though not completely. Fear doesn't leave so easily, not after it's had that kind of attention. I kept glancing at the side mirror, half expecting to see a shadow clinging to the ridge, some shape moving silently in perfect mimicry of my motions, but nothing came. The further I drove, the more I thought about how easy it is to dismiss fear. We like to tell ourselves it's irrational, that it's our mind playing tricks. But when you're alone in the forest and the forest decides to speak or act, you realize that fear is merely intelligence responding to the unknown. Survival instinct dressed in dread. When I finally reached a clearing near a small town off the highway, I stopped. I took a deep breath and leaned against the van. My hands were still trembling. My body was still humming with adrenaline. And I understood something I hadn't before. The forest hadn't just scared me, it had taught me. It had reminded me that solitude comes with responsibility, that curiosity can be dangerous, and that not all watchers are human, and not all mysteries are meant to be solved. I never went back to that ridgeline, and I never will, but I carry the memory of it. The sound of those clicks, the long moan drifting down through the trees, the 4 perfect marks on my van, with me every time I camp now. I learned to respect the silence, to listen more than I speak, to trust instincts that I once dismissed as paranoia. There's a strange power in fear when it's earned, when it isn't manufactured by movies or stories. It sharpens your perception, awakens your senses, and forces you to confront the boundaries between what is safe and what is unknown. And in that confrontation, there's a kind of clarity, a raw, unnerving understanding that the world isn't always as tame as it looks on a map, in a photo, in a guidebook. I still camp. I still seek out quiet places where the mountains cut the sky and the rivers carve their paths. But I do it differently now. I watch the tree lines, I listen to the wind, I note the smallest irregularities in the forest's rhythm, and I never, ever approach curiosity with naive confidence. That night along the Shasta Trinity Ridgeline changed me. It reminded me that the woods can speak in ways you never expect, and that listening and respecting what you don't understand is sometimes the only way to survive. I don't know exactly what made those sounds or why the forest touched my van. Maybe it was a creature, maybe something older, maybe just the forest itself testing a human intruder. I'll never know. What I do know is that fear has a voice. And when you hear it, when it scratches at the edges of your consciousness, you can either ignore it, or you can pay attention and live to tell the story. That night, I learned the difference. And as I drove away from the ridgeline, the van carrying me back into the light of the ordinary world, I felt a deep, permanent connection to the unseen. A recognition that some places, some nights will stay with you forever. Not in memory alone, but in the pulse of your veins, in the way your hands tighten on a steering wheel, in the quiet tension that tells you, never take the unknown lightly. Sometimes the forest doesn't need to chase you. Sometimes it just waits. And that waiting is enough to make you understand the full weight of what it means to be small, alone, and awake in the dark. I will always remember the ridgeline. I will always remember the clicks, the moan, the marks on the van, and I will always remember the lesson it taught me. Respect the unknown. Fear it, listen to it, and never, ever think you understand it fully. Because some screams aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to be survived. I never thought a simple camping trip would make me question not just the world around me, but my own instincts. My name is Marcus, I'm 32, and I've been RV camping across the United States for nearly a decade. I've learned to trust the rhythm of the road, the quiet conversations of rustling leaves, and the odd, distant howl of coyotes under a Texas moon. But that February in 2022 at Seminole Canyon Campground, something broke that rhythm. Something I couldn't have prepared for. The day had been crisp, the kind of cold that bites just enough to remind you that you're alive. I had parked my old Volkswagen camper on a narrow patch of cleared earth surrounded by the rugged limestone cliffs that give Seminole Canyon its name. The wind carried the scent of dry brush and the faint tang of river water down the canyon walls. It was serene, almost painfully so, the kind of serenity that makes you feel like you're invisible to the world. Except that, apparently, I wasn't. By mid-afternoon, I noticed him, a camper set up a few sites over, a man in his late 40s, graying hair and a weathered jacket. He seemed normal enough at first glance, the kind of solitary figure you see in the backcountry, quietly tending to a campfire or adjusting a tarp. But there was something slightly off. He never made direct eye contact, always averted gaze, shifting hands nervously. That first night, I caught him standing at the edge of his campsite, staring in my direction long after I thought he had gone to bed. I shook it off. Isolation does strange things to your imagination. My camper felt safe, insulated, the metallic hum of the fridge a lullaby against the silence outside. Yet, as I tried to sleep, I heard the faintest creak. Not from the wind, not from the old camper itself, but something deliberate, slow, stepping through the brush near my door. My heart kicked, but I told myself it was an animal. Coyotes, maybe, or a raccoon scavenging for scraps. Morning brought a sense of relief I couldn't shake. Over coffee, I watched him again from across the gap in the sights. He seemed normal, packing up, tying down ropes, moving like any other camper. And yet, when I glanced back at my own sight, I had the impossible feeling he'd been watching me all morning, silent, patient, like a shadow waiting for permission to step closer. I spent the day hiking the canyon trails, trying to distract myself, the cliffs' sun-bleached faces jagged and indifferent. But no matter how far I walked, that unease clung. When I returned in the late afternoon, my campfire still smoldering, I saw him again, this time closer. Too close. Not on his own sight, but just at the edge of mine, crouched behind a boulder, peering out as if testing my attention. My pulse spiked. I called out, trying to sound casual. "Hey, everything all right?" No answer. Just the wind whispering through the bare branches. By nightfall, I made sure every lock, every latch on the camper was secure. I paced inside, listening to the dark outside, imagining, hoping even that it was nothing. Then came the knocks. Soft at first, tentative, like someone testing a door that might not even exist. Tap, tap, tap. They came from outside, around the back of my camper. Each pause stretched longer, a heartbeat suspended in the chill night air. I debated stepping outside, debated calling the ranger station, debated whether I was losing my mind. Then, as suddenly as it started, the knocks stopped. Silence returned, thick and suffocating, pressing against the aluminum walls of my Volkswagen. I couldn't sleep that night. Every rustle, every shifting shadow became him, or maybe him and someone else. My imagination began to betray me. Each sound, each movement in the brush became a story my mind was eager to tell, a story where I was being watched, evaluated, and tested. I woke to the smell of smoke, acrid and sharp. My fire had been extinguished, ashes cold to the touch, but I caught movement beyond the campsite, a figure retreating into the canyon, deliberately careful not to reveal too much. I grabbed my binoculars. The man, my neighbor. I wanted to confront him, demand answers, but I hesitated. Part of me wanted to stay, to assert normalcy, while another, deeper, older whispered that some questions are safer left unasked. The rest of that day passed in tension. I packed extra gear, tightened straps, and kept my phone close, though service in the canyon was spotty at best. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of him, just far enough to be unnerving. A shadow behind a tree, a reflection in a canyon puddle, never close, never direct, but always present. By the third night, the dread had evolved into something heavier. He didn't knock this time. Instead, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunched along the narrow path to my camper, slow, careful, deliberate. I held my breath, counting each step as it circled my vehicle, then retreated. I didn't look out. I couldn't. My survival instincts wrestled with my curiosity, and for hours I simply waited, listening to the canyon's whispering secrets, imagining a man's eyes reflecting in the moonlight, calculating, watching, knowing I knew. The next morning, he was gone. No trace of him, no sign of where he had slept, what he had touched. I asked other campers, but no one had seen him arrive, and no one had seen him leave. I reported it to the ranger, who offered a shrug and a story about transient campers in the area, men who come and go like ghosts, but their words didn't settle my mind. They never do. Driving away from Seminole Canyon, I kept my eyes on every bend, every shadow. I replayed the encounter over and over, trying to rationalize, to make sense of a human presence that defied all explanation. And in the quiet of my Volkswagen, I realized something deeper. Fear isn't just about danger. It's about the feeling of being observed, evaluated, understood in ways you're not prepared to handle. It's about the collapse of certainty, even in the places you think you know. I've returned to Texas since then, to other campsites, other canyons, but that night in Seminole Canyon lingers, not as a ghost story, not as folklore, but as a lesson. Trust your instincts, respect the quiet spaces, and remember that not every neighbor is as they appear. Some vanish, leaving only the impression of themselves, and a reminder that the line between normal and dangerous is thinner than we ever imagine. I never thought a place so empty could feel so alive. My name is Lucas. I'm 32, and I've spent years chasing quiet spaces in my VW camper, seeking the kind of solitude most people only dream of. That August in 2020, I found myself wheeling my old van across the scorched expanse of Nevada's Black Rock Flats, where the ground stretches like pale, cracked skin under an endless sky. The heat pressed against the van, baking the metal and making the horizon shimmer in deceptive waves. The isolation was seductive at first, a siren song of absolute freedom, but it has a way of whispering, coaxing the tiniest fear into something unbearable. I parked my VW near an outcropping of jagged stones, far enough from the distant campers so I could pretend I was entirely alone. The van's engine hummed down, the silence settling in like a soft, heavy blanket. My first night was ordinary, the kind of quiet that lulls you into thinking the world is asleep. But even then, I noticed the radio. Static. A low, almost imperceptible buzz that didn't belong to any station. I fiddled with the knobs, thinking maybe my old van's electronics were just aging poorly. But the static never went away. It hovered, persistent, like a distant warning I couldn't yet decipher. By the second night, I realized the static was more than a malfunction. I was cooking dinner when the radio flared suddenly, cutting through the hum of my small stove. A voice, low and distorted, almost swallowed by the buzzing, had whispered a string of numbers, coordinates maybe, or something else entirely. I froze, the spatula still in my hand, staring at the small screen as the signal vanished into silence. I told myself it was nothing. Nevada has weird electrical fields. My mind was tired from the heat and the endless miles, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one watching. The wind began that night, creeping across the flat like fingernails scraping thin metal. At first, it was a soft whistle, then a howl that made the van tremble, rattling my cupboards and shaking the lights. Every gust seemed to carry a faint echo, a resonance of the voice that had been on the radio. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the dashboard, waiting for the static to return. And when it did, it was worse. A high-pitched keening that burrowed through my skull, accompanied by the unmistakable clatter of something outside, something pacing around the van just beyond the circle of my headlights. I wrestled with denial. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe a coyote had found the scent of food. Rationality fought the creeping dread, but the fear was a living thing now, feeding off my imagination. I started keeping the van locked, but the static would flare whenever I stepped outside. The electronics glitched in synchrony. The fridge would hum erratically, the lights flickered, delay, and even the tiny fan over the bed skipped beats like it was listening. And I swear, that when I peered into the darkness, I saw figures moving just at the edge of my vision, shadows stretching unnaturally, vanishing whenever I blinked. I tried sleep, tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the mind does not rest in the desert. Around 3 a.m., the radio erupted in a scream of static. Then, a voice, unmistakable now, clear and icy, "Do not leave." My heart stopped. The van's metal frame seemed to constrict around me. My hands shook, and the sense of being observed was no longer a whisper. It was a pulse, a rhythm in my bones. I realized I was no longer alone, and whatever was out there did not want me to leave. Or perhaps it did not want me to stay. I rose slowly, gripping the edge of the bed, listening. The desert seemed to inhale. Each breath of wind carried a vibration, a pulse synchronized with my own heartbeat. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was playing a prank. Maybe I'd stumbled into some old military testing ground. But the VW was old, stubbornly analog, the kind of van where interference would rarely be so consistent. And yet every electrical signal, every creak of the chassis, Every rustle outside reinforced the warning in my chest. There was something here, unseen but attentive, and it did not like being ignored. By morning, I was exhausted, almost zombified, yet I knew I could not simply wait for it to pass. I drove out, circling the flat slowly, searching for patterns. The radio sputtered, and through the static, I began hearing faint repetitions, the numbers again, almost like a code. My instincts screamed to follow them, yet reason argued the opposite. I camped on the move, letting the van's engine be my companion, and each hour brought new distortions. The temperature swung unpredictably, the sky flickered with heat mirages that looked like moving figures, and in the periphery of my eyes, the desert itself seemed to bend. I realized then the truth. The Black Rock Flats is not empty. It reacts. The electronics, the van, even my own mind, it all became a conduit. The more I resisted, the more insistent the interference. The numbers on the radio became clearer, a sequence that made no sense until I mapped them in the dirt beside the van. They weren't coordinates. They were warnings, not directions, but boundaries, invisible lines I was being cautioned against crossing. Nightfall brought another escalation. The wind turned sharp, slicing through the van's insulation. The static returned in waves, now accompanied by low, unplaceable groans. My senses sharpened, fear tethering me to every sound. The groans had rhythm, deliberate steps around the VW, circling, retreating, advancing. I could feel a gaze pressing on me from the void. I gripped the wheel, my body rigid, my mind racing through every survival instinct I had learned on years of solo trips. Sleep was impossible. Denial, now abandoned, was replaced by tense hyper-awareness. I became part of the environment, every creak of the van, every gust of wind, every shadow under the moonlight, a signal I could not ignore. By the third night, I understood something crucial. The desert itself tests you. The electronics glitching, the whispering static, the voices, they were challenges, boundaries I could not see, lines I could not cross. And I was not meant to be reckless. I stayed awake, tracking the patterns, learning the rhythms of this strange, sentient place. The static, once a harbinger of terror, became a guide. I followed its pulses cautiously, avoiding areas that seemed to hum with warning, steering clear of the places where my instincts screamed danger louder than any voice. I don't know what I would have done if I had ignored the warnings. Perhaps I would have left and never looked back, or perhaps curiosity would have been fatal. By dawn, I had learned to read the signals. The static, the groans, the shifting temperature. They were all part of a living map, a system of survival written in subtle, terrifying code. My fear became vigilance. My dread became preparation. The desert had humbled me, and in its quiet cruelty, I discovered a lesson no guidebook could teach. The fourth night arrived with a suffocating stillness, the kind that makes your own heartbeat echo like a drum in an empty cathedral. I could feel the desert waiting as if it had been biding its time, watching me adapt to its signals, testing whether I had learned enough to survive. The VW sat heavy on the cracked earth, its metal body humming faintly as if in conversation with the static on the radio. I had become attuned to its rhythms. A rise in pitch meant movement beyond the headlights. A stutter signaled proximity. A long, low growl warned of an unseen presence too close for comfort. I moved with the van, small adjustments to my route, careful not to disrupt the patterns I had begun to understand. Then it came. A sudden flare of light across the horizon, unnatural and jagged, snapping the darkness into a fractured mosaic of shadows. The radio screamed in response, static shredding through the quiet like broken glass, and the numbers that had once been distant, whispers, now rang out in sharp, clipped tones. They weren't just warnings anymore. They were instructions. I couldn't comprehend them fully, but instinct drove me to obey. I steered the VW along the pale flats, tracing the lines I could only feel, avoiding the invisible boundaries marked by the desert's invisible hand. Something shifted in the wind then, a subtle change that made my skin prickle. It wasn't a gust, not really, but a pulse that carried across the flat like a heartbeat too slow, too deliberate. I knew without thinking that I was being followed, not by an animal, not by a person, but by the consciousness of the place itself. The static flared again, and for a heartbeat, the numbers morphed into a voice, almost human but warped, distorted, filled with a warning that bypassed reason. Do not cross. You are not ready. My palms were slick on the steering wheel, my breath ragged. Every rational thought told me to leave, to accelerate blindly and escape the expanse, but my curiosity, my survival instinct, kept me tethered to the code. I parked briefly near a ridge, the van's headlights illuminating nothing but the flat, broken earth. I could hear it now, clearly over the static. Footsteps, deliberate and measured, circling the VW. Not animal, not mechanical. I felt eyes on the back of my neck, and I realized that the desert had found a new way to communicate. My mind raced to understand, to interpret. Every shadow, every flicker of movement outside became a piece of the puzzle. I realized then that fear was not my enemy. It was a tool, sharpening me, heightening my senses, teaching me to read the imperceptible signs that had been invisible before. And then the van's electronics failed completely. Lights flickered once, twice, then died. The radio went silent. I was plunged into darkness so complete it felt solid, pressing against me from all sides. The footsteps stopped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. My own pulse roared in my ears. For a moment, the desert was a blank, a void, and I understood in a way I hadn't before. This was a test of presence, of awareness. The desert didn't just want me to survive, it wanted me to understand. I lit a small flashlight, its beam trembling in my shaking hand. The static returned, softer now, guiding me. Slowly, I followed the sequence of signals, moving in the rhythm I had learned. The numbers repeated, the instructions clear in ways I could feel more than see. Avoid the mirages, respect the boundaries, never look directly at the shadows. Step by careful step, I moved across the flat, each movement deliberate, each breath measured. The footsteps resumed, distant now, fading as I obeyed the invisible rules. By dawn, I was at the edge of the flats, the VW barely a silhouette against the rising sun. I stopped and looked back. The expanse behind me shimmered in the early light, ordinary again, silent, as if nothing had happened. The radio buzzed once, weakly, and then fell silent, leaving only the hum of the van's engine. I had survived, but I had learned that survival here was not about strength or speed. It was about attention, respect, and surrender to the subtle cues of the environment. The desert had tested me, had bent my perception, had forced me to confront fear in its purest form, and I had emerged not unscarred but enlightened. Driving away, I realized that the terror had been more than a challenge. It had been a revelation. The smallest signals, the faintest warnings, can carry truths more vital than any map or guidebook. The Black Rock Flats had no monsters in the traditional sense. Its horror was subtler, psychological, a haunting woven into the static of a radio, the flicker of lights, the pulse of the wind across endless broken earth. And it demanded awareness, vigilance, and humility from anyone who dared to wander its expanse. Now, months later, whenever I tune a radio in the middle of nowhere and catch the faintest hiss of static, I feel a twinge of recognition, a pulse of memory. I remember the boundaries I traced with trembling hands in the dust, the groans that circled the van like a living thing, the invisible rules that shaped the desert itself. And I know that the terror was not just in what I saw or heard, but in what I failed to understand at first. The desert and its warnings were alive in ways I could barely comprehend. I tell this story not to frighten, but to remind anyone who travels the solitary roads in a camper, in a van, in a quiet place that seems abandoned. Pay attention. Listen. Respect the signals. The wilderness is not merely a backdrop for adventure. It is a sentient observing force. Ignore its warnings, and you risk more than fear. You risk vanishing into a world that seems empty, but is anything but. When I finally left Black Rock Flats, I didn't look back, yet I carry it with me, in every hum of static, in every flicker of lights in an old vehicle, in every whisper of wind across an open expanse. The VW may have been just a van, but it became my shield, my guide, and my witness. That August night taught me something profound. Fear is not weakness. It is attention. It is connection. It is survival. And sometimes the scariest places are the ones that teach us the most. I never thought a simple camping trip could twist into something that gnawed at the edges of my mind for months afterward. My name is Lucas. I'm 32, and I've spent more nights on wheels than in a real bed. That June, I pulled my RV deep into Alabama's Cheaha wilderness, chasing nothing more than solitude, pine-scented air, and the kind of silence only heavy forests can offer. It was late afternoon when I finally found a clearing that seemed perfect: flat ground, gentle slope, and a view of the fading sunlight spilling over the ridges. The forest itself felt alive, but not in the friendly way I was used to. It hummed with a low, persistent vibration, subtle enough that at first I chalked it up to the wind through the trees. By the time I finished leveling the RV, the sun was sinking, and the shadows were stretching like long fingers across the campsite. The first odd thing I noticed was the way the silence seemed to deepen whenever I stopped moving. I'd walk to set up the folding chairs, and as soon as I paused, a quiet pressure would press against my ears, a weight that made me feel unreasonably watched. I shook it off. I always do. But the forest had a rhythm that didn't belong to me. Night came, and with it, the familiar rituals: locking doors, checking the propane, adjusting the awning. I tried to read, but the pages felt heavy in my hands, and every rustle outside made me tense, heart jumping, though the wind was still. That first night I woke just before midnight. A subtle scratching sound, soft but deliberate, echoed from beneath the RV. My rational mind told me it was probably a raccoon or a stray dog, or maybe even a branch brushing the chassis, but the sound had a cadence that felt impatient, almost intelligent, as if whatever it was knew I was listening. I pressed my ear to the floor of the RV. The scratches stopped. Silence returned, but heavier now, like a held breath that made my chest ache. I tried to fall asleep, but every creak of the RV's frame, every distant owl call, stretched seconds into a maddening eternity. I kept telling myself it's just an animal. Anything else is absurd. Yet, even as I reassured myself, a tight knot of dread began to coil in my stomach, and I realized I hadn't felt this alone in years. Not really alone, I corrected myself. It was more than that. I felt observed. The next morning, I moved cautiously, peering under the RV before I climbed in. Nothing. Leaves, pine needles, a small scuff where the metal had brushed a rock, but nothing that made sense. Yet a gnawing sensation in my gut wouldn't let me forget. By the time I set out for a short hike along the ridge, my mind was replaying the night in loops. The scratches, the silence, the way shadows seemed to cling longer than they should. Each step into the forest made me more aware of every snapping twig, every rustling leaf. As the sun dipped again on the second evening, I returned to camp with a heightened alertness. The forest felt thicker now, its darkness pressing closer, and I noticed how the shapes between the trees seemed to shift whenever I blinked. I tried to eat, to read, even to take a hot shower, but the RV felt like a cage. Then it started again, the scratching. Not loud, but deliberate, almost rhythmic, right beneath where I slept. My first instinct was to call out, to demand the intruder identify itself, but my voice felt small, swallowed by the night. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the edge of the RV. The beam cut across the ground, illuminating nothing but dirt and scattered pine needles. Yet the scratches resumed as soon as the light swept away. Something was there, moving in the dark, but each time I tried to confirm its presence, my mind balked. Rational explanations fought with the creeping certainty that this was not ordinary wildlife. I felt my pulse in my ears, the forest vibrating against my ribs. Sleep was impossible. My mind raced through every worst-case scenario, each one more horrifying than the last. By the third night, I wasn't just nervous, I was consumed. Each sound became a sentence of accusation. Every shift in shadow a premonition. I found myself whispering to the forest, trying to negotiate with the unseen presence. "I'm just passing through," I muttered. "I don't want trouble." And for a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath, but the scratching persisted, always beneath me. never leaving. I tried reasoning with myself. It was impossible for anything to be directly under the RV. The clearance was too high, the terrain uneven. Yet when I lay awake, listening to the faint but insistent scrapes, it felt like whatever was there was learning, adapting, waiting. My mind became a trap I couldn't escape from, logic and fear wrestling, neither willing to yield. I thought of leaving, of hitting the road and never looking back, but some part of me wanted to confront it, to peer into the darkness and name the thing that haunted me. Late into that night, exhaustion blurred the line between reality and imagination. Every creak of the RV floor became a footstep, every whisper of wind a voice. I clutched my blanket like a talisman, forcing my eyes shut, willing myself to sleep, and then I heard it clearly. The scratches stopped, and in their place, a soft, deliberate thud right under the rear axle. I froze, heart hammering, chest tight, and realized my rational mind was no longer in control. My body screamed to flee, but my legs refused. I was a spectator in my own fear. I never saw what was under the RV, and part of me is grateful. The next morning, I examined the ground carefully. There were no tracks, no marks that suggested a wild animal, no disturbance in the earth. Yet the memory of the night remained, vivid as fire, coiling around every shadow I saw in the forest from that moment onward. I packed quickly, leaving without a trace, but the feeling stayed. The forest had left a mark inside me. A lesson, whispered and heavy. There are places, even in the beauty of Cheha Wilderness, where the mind is prey, where fear grows not from what is seen, but from what might be. I learned something important on that trip, that the quietest threats are often the most potent, that the mind can be a landscape as treacherous as any wilderness, and that sometimes you carry the echoes of fear with you, long after you've left the forest behind. Driving away, I felt relief. Yes, but also a lingering unease, the subtle sensation that somewhere beneath a tree or the edge of a ridge, the scratches continue, waiting for the next visitor who dares to sleep too deeply in the dark. The drive out of Cheaha felt unreal. The roads wound like twisted ribbons through the forest, yet I couldn't shake the sense that something was trailing me, not on the asphalt, but in the spaces just beyond my vision. Each time I glanced in the rearview mirror, shadows clung too close to the tree line as if the night itself had grown legs and followed me home. I kept repeating to myself, it's over, but the words sounded hollow, an incantation against a lingering presence. Back at my favorite rest stop, I stopped to breathe. The RV's engine hummed softly, a mundane reassurance. Yet when I stepped outside, the silence pressed again, unnatural, expectant. I wanted to dismiss it as imagination, exhaustion, the strain of isolation, but there was a weight in the air, the kind that makes you notice every whisper of wind, every twitch of leaf. I leaned against the RV, staring at the shadowy woods across the highway, and I realized I was trembling, not from cold, not from fatigue, but from the memory of waiting, listening, the scratches beneath my bed. Sleep that night was fractured. Dreams, or maybe memories of the RV's floor vibrating under something unseen, crept into my mind. I awoke repeatedly, heart hammering, convinced that every creak of my small apartment's floorboards echoed the rhythm of Cheha's forest. The scratches had planted themselves inside me, a quiet, insistent presence that no door, no lock, no distance could exorcise. Days later, I returned to the site in my memory, retracing each step in thought, trying to rationalize the fear. Maybe it had been a raccoon, a large opossum, a branch scraping against the metal. Maybe my mind had amplified ordinary sounds into something sinister, and yet deep down, I knew that what had occurred didn't obey reason. My instinct, the raw, primal part of me that I usually try to silence, had screamed, and I had felt that scream ripple through the night. Friends asked what happened. I told them I had felt uneasy, that the forest had been different. Some laughed, some frowned. No one could understand the sensation of being watched by something unseen, the slow gnawing of dread that pressed into your chest until you can barely breathe. And I wondered if I wanted them to understand. Fear like that isn't easily shared. It lives inside, folds into your bones, changes the way you look at quiet places, at the spaces beneath your feet, at the dark corners of a familiar room. Weeks later, I tried to convince myself I had overreacted. I went camping again. Not in Cheha. Not anywhere near the wilderness that had haunted me, but the quiet unease returned with every creak of the RV floor, every shadow that lingered too long in the corner of my eye. I realized fear is not always about the presence of a thing. Sometimes it's about the absence of certainty, the gap between what is seen and what is known. And once that gap exists, it can stretch infinitely, a shadow without source, a rhythm without origin. I still carry the lesson with me. That June, the Cheha Wilderness taught me something profound, that the world is larger, stranger, and more insistent than we allow ourselves to believe. That fear is not weakness. It is proof that you are alive, aware, and capable of encountering the unknown with open eyes. That sometimes the most terrifying thing under an RV or under the floor of your mind is the realization that some presences, some sensations refuse to be explained and insist upon shaping the way you move, the way you breathe, and the way you sleep. Driving through the countryside now, I notice small details I would have missed before. The hollow note of a wind through a hollowed log, the rustle of a deer in the distance, the pattern of shadows across a dirt road at dusk. I feel a kinship with the forest, a wary respect, and a subtle thrill. Fear is no longer only a threat, it is a companion, reminding me that there is life outside of comfort, that the mind can be stretched, that courage is often the act of facing the unknown, even when the unknown might only exist in the spaces between your thoughts. And sometimes in the quiet of night, when the wind is still and my RV settles with that familiar creak, I imagine the thing beneath the RV still there, patient, waiting, a rhythm of scratches that marks the line between the known and the unknowable. And I smile. Not because I am unafraid, but because I now understand the value of listening to fear, of respecting it, of letting it teach you the contours of the world and your place within it. Cheha will always linger in memory, a testament to how close reality and imagination can brush against one another, and how the forest can reach inside you without ever breaking a branch. I cannot say what lurked beneath that RV. I cannot say if it was anything at all, or if the only creature that truly matters is the one in my own mind, learning, stretching, waiting for the next heartbeat, the next night, the next camper brave enough to rest above it. But I know this, I will never forget the scratches. I will never forget the hush of the forest, the slow tightening of the chest, the rhythmic pulse of terror that taught me something I could not have learned elsewhere. Fear, in its purest form, is intimate. It does not shout, it whispers. It scratches beneath the floor of what you believe is safe. And in that whisper, in that scratch, I found something more valuable than comfort. A vivid, aching awareness that life is deeper, darker, and infinitely stranger than I ever allowed myself to see. I still remember the first night I pulled my old Volkswagen camper into the shadowed edges of Montana's Gallatin Range. The sky was bruised purple, the sun's last warmth clinging desperately to the jagged peaks, as I eased onto a narrow dirt path that wound into the trees. My name's Aaron, I'm 34, and I've been chasing the solitude of America's wild campgrounds for years. But that September evening, something felt off in a way I couldn't name. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was the kind of quiet that presses in behind your eyes and lingers in the throat. I parked on a small clearing near a brook, the kind of spot that looks perfect on a map but hides its own secrets. The camper hissed as I closed the door, the interior lights spilling warmth into the dark. I unpacked, set up the stove, and tried to coax a fire to life. I remember that fire. No matter what I did, logs perfectly arranged, kindling cracked and dry, matches struck with every ounce of patience I could muster, it wouldn't stay lit. Sparks died instantly, smoke curling in frustrated little spirals, teasing my senses. I chalked it up to damp wood, to high altitude, to the stubbornness of an old stove. But deep down, even then, I felt the unease clawing. Something about the shadows beyond the clearing felt alive. The first sounds were subtle, just the brook and the wind brushing against pines, or at least that's what I told myself. Then I caught it, a snapping of twigs not far from the camper, rhythmic in a way that suggested intent. I froze. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, loud enough to drown out reason. Rationality battled instinct. Who could be out here? The trail is long, the nearest road miles away, and yet something was moving closer. I reached for the flashlight, my hands shaking, the beam cutting through the black. Nothing. Just a silhouette of gnarled branches, a shadow that seemed to flicker just beyond the light's reach. I tried to tell myself it was deer, maybe a fox. Anything to silence the prickling sensation crawling over my skin. I crawled back to the stove, attempted the fire again, and noticed how the darkness felt wrong, thick, almost tactile. I could feel it pushing against my shoulders, a weight that didn't belong. I built the fire in a different part of the clearing, closer to the camper, closer to safety, but every flame flickered and died as if inhaling the air had suffocated it. I sat, huddled in a sleeping bag, staring at the tiny sparks and listening. At first, I heard a whisper, or what I thought was a whisper, like the wind had learned to speak in syllables. Minutes became hours. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, every small animal sound felt amplified. My rational mind fought, whispering, "You're just tired, you're imagining it." But I couldn't shake the sense that the forest was shifting, leaning toward me, waiting. I tried to sleep, curled tightly, listening to the silent cadence of fear. I caught the scent then, a sharp, acrid tang, something between scorched wood and damp earth, almost chemical. I rolled over, heart hammering, eyes straining in the dark, and then I saw it, or thought I did, a movement at the edge of the clearing, a figure crouched just beyond the trees, watching. I froze. Breathing slowed, but the terror didn't ease. I whispered to myself, "Stay calm. It's just a trick of the shadows." But the fire wouldn't catch. Logs snapped when I tried again, almost deliberately. The whispering grew louder, or maybe it was me imagining it, but it sounded like voices, low murmuring. Not human voices. Not entirely. I couldn't tell if they were calling me or mocking me, if they wanted me to see them or stay blind. My instincts screamed to leave, to drive the camper down that dark, winding dirt road immediately. But I stayed. Curiosity mingled with fear, a dangerous blend, and I watched as the forest seemed to pulse around me, alive with a presence I couldn't name. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time blurred. I caught glimpses of movement, not quite figures, not quite shadows, always at the edges of vision. My mind began constructing shapes, faces, intentions as the isolation gnawed at me. My internal dialogue turned frantic. What am I missing? What's out there? Should I confront it or flee? And the forest answered in a way it never could have in daylight. A sudden snap of a branch, then silence. Then a low, guttural breath, or maybe the wind mimicking one, that seemed to originate from just behind the camper. I couldn't tell if it was real or my mind unraveling. By the time the sky began to pale with the first hints of dawn, the fire still wouldn't hold. Exhaustion weighed on me, but there was a strange clarity in my terror. I understood then that the forest wasn't malicious. It was indifferent, vast, patient. It didn't need to chase me or hurt me. Its presence alone, its ancient, knowing silence, was enough to awaken the fear buried in the heart of any traveler who thinks themselves alone. I learned something vital that night. The wilderness has rules beyond reason, beyond experience, and our survival depends on listening, on humility, on honoring its hidden depths. The morning light didn't bring comfort. It was pale, hesitant, and it seemed to leak into the clearing like a reluctant witness. I stepped outside the camper, the frost dampening my boots, the chill gnawing at my nerves. The forest looked calm, innocent even, but my senses screamed that the night had been more than my imagination. The footprints weren't mine. Small, jagged, half-hidden in the leaf litter and frost, leading from the edge of the trees toward my camper, then circling back into the shadows. My stomach sank. I knelt, tracing the edges, feeling the subtle indentations in the cold soil. No animal left marks like these. They were deliberate, cautious, watching. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I'd been alone, and my mind had conjured monsters to keep company in the dark. I started the Volkswagen, engine grumbling to life, the vibrations soothing but shallow. I drove slowly down the dirt path, ears straining, eyes scanning for movement, for any hint that I wasn't as alone as I wanted to believe. But the clearing stayed behind me, quiet, almost patient. I reached a bend in the road, and then I saw it, or felt it. A figure standing where the trees gave way to the open trail. I slammed the brakes. The shadow didn't move. It wasn't a human. Not quite. Its outline was twisted, elongated, wrong in a way that made the rational mind hesitate. My chest tightened, the pulse hammering as fear became tangible, like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. I forced myself to take a breath, to ground myself. The figure vanished when I blinked, or perhaps it had never been solid. My mind recoiled at the thought, the rational side trying to grasp at logic, at science, at the comfort of daylight. But fear has its own language. It doesn't need reason. I drove on, faster now, the forest pressing against the edges of the road as if reaching to reclaim me. Every curve of the path seemed to hide more than trees. Twisted shadows, glimpses of movement, the faint, unmistakable echo of the whispering from the night before. By the time I reached the small town on the outskirts of the Gallatin Range, my hands were raw from gripping the wheel, my mind frayed at the edges. I stopped at a cafe that smelled of strong coffee and fried bread, hoping the normalcy of daylight would anchor me. The locals were kind, unaware, chatting casually about the harvest, the weather, the predictable beauty of their mountain home. I smiled, nodded, but felt like I was walking through a dream with shadows still clinging to the corners. That night, I camped further down the range, choosing a site closer to a river and away from the thick pines. I brought extra kindling, and for the first time in hours, the fire caught and roared. I sat close, staring into the flames, the crackle of the wood a comfort to the frayed nerves. But even as the light painted the clearing in gold, the unease lingered. I realized then that fear doesn't always announce itself with figures or sounds. Sometimes it sits quiet in the mind, in the spaces between logs snapping and flames rising, waiting for the next traveler to be unprepared. I spent the night awake, listening. The wind's voice was different now, soft, almost friendly, but still I felt watched, not by someone malicious, but by the land itself. It was a reminder of the untamed, unpredictable beauty of these mountains and of my own limits. I learned to respect that night, to carry its memory not as a horror story, but as a lesson. To camp in the Gallatin Range, or anywhere in the wilderness, is to embrace vulnerability, to acknowledge that some mysteries are meant to unsettle, to teach patience, awareness, and humility. The experience changed the way I approached every trip after. I double-checked the firewood, studied the terrain, and carried a sense of respect for the quiet shadows that lingered just out of sight. I never encountered the figure again, but its presence, or the memory of it, became a compass. It taught me that fear isn't the absence of courage. It's the presence of understanding, the recognition of forces larger than ourselves, forces we can't control, but must honor. Driving away from that first clearing, the Gallatin Range receding behind me in long stretches of pine and rock, I felt a strange gratitude. That night, the fire that wouldn't stay lit became more than an annoyance. It became a teacher. And in the solitude, in the fear, I realized that the most profound lessons come wrapped in moments of terror. The forest whispers its secrets only to those who listen, and the echoes of that night stay with me, a constant reminder that even in fear, there is wisdom, and in darkness, there is a path forward, if you're willing to see it. Even now, when I return to campgrounds, I find myself scanning the edges of the trees, watching for shadows that move differently, listening for whispers in the wind. I don't seek them, they find me. And in the stillness between heartbeat and breath, I remember Montana, the stubborn fire, and the strange, watching presence that taught me how deep fear can go and how it can awaken a respect for life, for wilderness, and for the small, fragile courage we carry when we decide to venture into the unknown. Because in the end, the fire that wouldn't stay lit wasn't failure. It was initiation. It was a warning, a lesson, and a gift. And every camper who ventures into the wild should understand this. Fear is not an enemy. It is a guide. And sometimes the forest waits, not to harm, but to show you who you truly are when the night comes alive and the shadows start to watch. I never thought a quiet January night in Oregon could feel so loud. My name is Lucas Harper. I'm 34, and I've been RV camping across the country for nearly a decade. Most of the time, it's the kind of solitude you crave, the kind where the wind in the trees is your only conversation, and the distant crash of the ocean waves is a lullaby. But that night at Fort Stevens State Park, something shifted, and I realized that isolation can sometimes feel less like peace and more like being watched. I pulled my Volkswagen camper into one of the emptier spots near the old barracks at the skeletal remains of rusting artillery scattered like forgotten bones. The sky was a bruised gray, threatening snow, though nothing had fallen yet. The wind off the Columbia River was a constant, low howl pressing against the thin aluminum walls of my van. I thought it was just the usual winter chill, but even as I unpacked, something in the atmosphere felt off. I like to arrive early and explore. I walked along the deserted shoreline, boots sinking slightly in the wet sand, the smell of salt and decay filling my nose. Every so often a gull cried somewhere overhead, but mostly it was silent, an unsettling kind of quiet. I told myself I was imagining things when I heard a faint hum, soft, high-pitched, almost like a distant engine. It didn't belong to any boat I could see, and the closer I listened, the more it seemed to float, not move. I shrugged it off and went back to my van. Inside, I started my usual evening routine, a cup of black coffee, checking the maps, jotting notes about the trails I wanted to explore the next day. The hum had followed me, persistent now, almost imperceptibly louder, like it was hovering somewhere just outside the van. My first thought was a drone, maybe a security patrol. But the park was nearly deserted. No rangers had come by all day. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, sweeping the sand in the perimeter of the van. Nothing, not even the usual wildlife movement. My rational mind told me to ignore it, but the hum was different now. It wasn't mechanical. It felt intentional, deliberate, like something or someone was observing. I tried to tell myself that was ridiculous, that the shadows were playing tricks. Night fell faster than I expected. The sky blackened and the temperature dropped sharply, my breath puffing in small clouds. I could see my own shadow stretching across the sand, but behind me was something moving. Or was it just me, too alert to every twitch of the branches above? I froze, listening. A soft tap, like someone had lightly knocked on the camper's side, echoed in the darkness. My pulse jumped. The first thought in my head was intruder. The next was, don't panic, it's probably the wind. But the wind had no hands. I grabbed the flashlight and circled the van, the beam cutting through the shadows. Nothing. Just the static sway of leafless trees and the occasional glint of the artillery relics scattered around. But the hum had returned, now unmistakable, and it was steady, relentless, coming from somewhere overhead. My stomach churned. The rational part of me screaming that drones don't usually hover silently for hours. I decided to climb into the camper and lock myself inside. The door shut behind me with a finality that felt too heavy. My hands shook as I bolted it and dimmed the lights, trying to convince myself that all of this was a trick of isolation. That's when I noticed the first real sign that I wasn't imagining it. A shadow flickered across the thin curtain in the back window. Not mine. Not from the trees, something external. My chest tightened. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or maybe a stray dog, but the shape was wrong. Too angular, too deliberate. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening, barely daring to breathe. The hum wasn't moving anymore. It had settled, waiting, like a predator that knows you're aware but doesn't care. Every instinct in me screamed to drive away, but my phone had no signal. I was trapped in the dark. The Volkswagen suddenly feeling too small, too exposed, with the frozen sand and artillery ruins stretching like silent witnesses beyond my windows. I wanted to convince myself to step outside, to confront it, but fear had lodged itself deep in my chest, a cold, immovable weight. I tried rational thought. Maybe it's a local prankster. Maybe it's some kind of malfunctioning weather drone. Maybe I was just tired, letting my imagination bleed into the night. But even as I whispered these reassurances to myself, the humming shifted slightly, a soft wave like it was inching closer along the perimeter of the camper. And then I heard it. Slow, deliberate scraping, something against the metal siding. Not hard enough to dent it, but enough to hear. My heart leapt. My first impulse was to bolt, to drive, but I was frozen, caught in a storm of denial and terror. I tried to peer through the blinds, but the shadow had disappeared. Only the hum remained, vibrating through the walls, through my bones. I remember curling into the corner of the bed, clutching a flashlight like a lifeline, and praying it was gone. Hours seemed to stretch, the hum never fading, never leaving. Sleep refused me, the night pressing in, every gust of wind sounding like footsteps on sand, every distant wave crashed like a warning. When dawn finally arrived, it didn't bring relief. Only a pale gray light that revealed the world outside was perfectly normal. The sand undisturbed, no footprints, no drone, no sign of any human or animal. I told myself it was over, and maybe it was. But something inside me had changed. Every time I camped near open shorelines after that, I felt it. The subtle weight of being observed, the faint echo of that hum, like a reminder that silence is never really empty. Even after dawn, the unease clung to me like a second skin. I packed the Volkswagen slowly, my hands trembling slightly each time they brushed against cold metal. I tried to reason. Maybe it was fatigue, maybe the isolation had played tricks on me, but deep down, I knew that the dread I felt was real. The air seemed heavier than usual, and every gust of wind sounded too precise, almost like it had an agenda. I decided to take a short walk before leaving the campsite to shake off the lingering tension. The sand felt firmer in daylight, but every step echoed unnaturally loud, as if the earth itself were listening. My shadow stretched long in the weak morning sun, but something else moved at the edge of my vision, quick, fleeting, always gone when I turned. Panic started to rise, a slow burn in my chest, and I realized I was being watched in a way that made every rational explanation insufficient. I followed the shoreline toward the remnants of the old fort, hoping distance might clarify things, perhaps even dispel my fear. The artillery, rusted and silent under the weak winter light, seemed to lean toward me like silent sentinels, their metal surfaces catching the pale sun in a way that made them seem alive. Then I heard it, a faint mechanical whirring, low and deliberate. I froze mid-step, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sound wasn't moving, but it was precise, intentional, impossible to ignore. I glanced up. At first, I saw nothing, just the gray sky and skeletal branches swaying in the breeze. And then, there it was, a small drone hovering silently above the tree line, black against the dull sky, unmoving, its camera lens catching the morning light. It wasn't casual, it was deliberate, focused, observing. My rational mind scrambled for explanation. Park research, local enthusiasts, security surveillance, none fit. No one was supposed to be here. The drone tilted slightly as if acknowledging my presence, and I felt the shift in the air, a subtle pressure that made my skin crawl. Fear roared through me, a tide breaking over rational thought. I ran, toward the van, toward the highway, toward anything that promised escape, but each step felt measured, as if the world itself conspired to keep me in that haunted stretch of beach. The sand resisted my movement, each footprint seeming to drag behind me, heavy with the memory of the night. I reached the Volkswagen and slammed the door shut. Hands shaking, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed to life, then roared. I glanced into the rearview mirror. The tree line, the artillery, the sand, everything appeared normal. No drone, no shadow, no hum, just the silence I had craved before. But I knew it hadn't vanished. It had only retreated, patient and waiting. Driving away, the memory of the previous night burned in my mind. I replayed every detail, the hum, the knocks, the shadow across the window. Each was a thread in a pattern I hadn't fully seen at the time. The lesson was clear, though it came with a chill I couldn't shake. Isolation can magnify perception, but it can also reveal truths that are easily ignored in the daylight. I pulled over at a rest stop further down the coast, hands still gripping the wheel, and finally let myself breathe. The waves crashed against the shore in the distance, familiar, ordinary, yet carrying the weight of what I had endured. I thought about how easily fear could have frozen me completely, how I might have ignored my instincts and walked straight into danger. That hum, the scraping, the hovering presence, it had forced me to confront the edges of my courage, the limits of my rationality. For hours after, I replayed the night in my mind. I tried to rationalize it again, drone enthusiasts, hallucinations, exhaustion, but nothing fit neatly. There was a weight to it, a deliberate pressure in the air that told me the world is larger, stranger, and sometimes more watchful than we like to admit. That day I learned a lesson I carry with me on every trip. Fear is a guide, subtle but insistent. Ignoring it can leave you exposed. Heeding it can keep you alive. Weeks later, I returned to Fort Stevens, not to confront the drone, not to prove anything, but to understand it. The beach was calm, empty, sun sparkling off the water. No hum, no scraping, no shadow. Yet, standing there, I felt it again, faintly, almost imperceptibly, like a whisper at the edge of my hearing. The world is full of these quiet watchers, I realized, and sometimes the bravest act is simply to acknowledge their presence and move with care, not fear. I drove away that day, the Volkswagen carrying me back towards civilization, back to friends, to warmth, to ordinary routines. But I haven't forgotten the quiet dread of that January night. Every time I camp near an empty shoreline or under skeletal trees, I feel the hum in my bones, the subtle pressure of observation, the knowledge that the world is alive in ways we can't always see. I don't tell many people this story. It sounds insane, unbelievable. But every time I recount it to myself, the fear returns, sharp and precise, a reminder that the edges of our world are not always safe, that sometimes the silence itself can be the most dangerous companion. And in that silence, in that observing quiet, I found a strange clarity. Survival isn't about avoiding fear. It's about listening to it, respecting it, letting it guide you through the shadows. The world is darker, deeper, and far stranger than we imagine, but we move forward anyway. We keep driving, keep exploring, keep stepping into the night, because beyond the fear, beyond the hum and the watching eyes, there is always a horizon waiting to be discovered. The moment I rolled into Land Between the Lakes that April evening in 2019, I felt a quiet weight in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. My name is Marcus, I'm 32, and I've been chasing the solitude of America's back roads in my old Volkswagen camper for years. There's something about the creak of hinges and the smell of pine that feels like freedom, until it doesn't. That night, as I drove past the rolling ridges and patches of fog pooling low across the lake, I felt it, a subtle tightening in my chest, a warning that the woods weren't empty. I shook it off. I always do. I had set up camp near a small, secluded spot just off the main gravel road. The lot was bordered by towering oaks and maples, whose branches twisted like skeletal fingers, and the lake's surface reflected the waning sunlight with a deceptive calm. I parked the Volkswagen, the engine ticking as it cooled, and began the familiar ritual of leveling the camper, plugging in the small generator, scat, and setting out my camp chair. The air smelled damp, rich with mud and decaying leaves, and every rustle of a branch made me pause. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe it wasn't. As night fell, the forest transformed. Darkness pooled into the corners of my vision, and the usual comforting chorus of crickets and frogs seemed off, irregular, almost deliberate. I poured a cup of coffee and settled into the camper, the soft hum of the generator masking the distant sounds of something moving among the trees. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe a raccoon. But when I glanced at the lake's glassy surface, the reflection of my VW seemed slightly wrong. I could feel it in my chest, a prickle of unease that made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I first noticed it, the back window of the Volkswagen. At first, I thought it was condensation, fogging from the warm interior, but as I squinted into the darkness, I saw it, a handprint. Smudged, imperfect, pressed flat against the glass from the outside. I froze. My mind spun for a moment between denial and panic. How could someone or something have left a handprint here? The campsite was isolated, the road behind me empty for miles. My heart started to pound. I pressed my face to the glass, breathing shallow, trying to rationalize. Maybe an animal, a fallen branch, but the fingers were long, thin, almost human. And the faint smear of mud on the window suggested deliberate contact, not an accidental brushing. I swallowed hard and tried to calm myself, reminding myself I was experienced, that I knew the difference between fear and reality. I stepped back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching, waiting. The wind shifted, carrying a low, wet rustle through the trees, like fingertips sliding along bark. I caught myself imagining shapes moving just beyond the edge of my vision. The kind of shapes you convince yourself are only shadows until they step too close. My hand hovered over the camper door handle, every instinct screaming to leave, to drive back down the dark gravel road into the safety of the highway lights. But curiosity rooted me in place. I had always come into the woods for that, the raw, unfiltered brush with something unknown. And yet this felt different, personal, watching me. I turned on the camper's interior light, and the handprint seemed to pulse in the reflection, almost mocking me. I could see the slight smear, as if someone or something had pressed with just enough force to leave a mark, then stepped back silently into the night. I tried to breathe, to tell myself it was a prank. Maybe a camper had passed earlier and left it. But the rest of the site was empty. No tire tracks, no discarded trash, nothing to suggest another soul had been here. Hours passed in that tense, brittle silence. Every tiny sound, the groan of the VW's frame cooling, the distant splash of something in the lake, the whisper of branches brushing together, was amplified. My mind twisted reality with each creak. I considered leaving, just driving off into the night, but the thought of the unknown lurking beyond my headlights made me hesitate. It wasn't just fear. It was fascination, the dangerous draw of the inexplicable. At some point, I dozed off in the chair, sitting upright with the mug of coffee trembling in my hands. Dreams, or maybe hallucinations, slipped into my rest. I could feel hands brushing along my shoulders, hear whispers that didn't belong. I jolted awake to the moonlight spilling across the campsite, catching the handprint again. Only now, faint streaks ran down the glass, as if moisture, or something more, had slid downward since the first appearance. My stomach twisted, and I knew I had to confront it. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the chill of April night pressing against my skin. The handprint was gone. My heart sank and then thumped in relief. Or was it disappointment? I scoured the perimeter of the VW, scanning for footprints, branches disturbed, anything. Nothing. The forest seemed to hold its breath again, the usual nocturnal chorus strangely absent. I felt exposed, a single human form swallowed by the vast, watching woods. I returned to the camper and sat in silence, the generator's hum my only companion. My rational mind fought the unease gnawing at my chest. I told myself this was the forest's way of reminding me of my place in it, the illusion of control shattered. Every sense was heightened. The smell of wet pine needles was sharp, the damp air almost tactile against my skin. I felt every heartbeat, every pull of my muscles as though the night itself were measuring me. When the first hints of dawn broke, the tension didn't leave, it transformed. Shadows retreated, but the memory of the handprint remained, pressed against the back of my mind. I packed up quickly, avoiding the quiet paths I had walked the night before. Driving away, I couldn't help but glance back through the rear window, half expecting to see those long, thin fingers pressed there again, as if the forest had claimed me, just for a moment. That morning, as the sun painted gold across the lake, I realized something about the wilderness that I hadn't before. It isn't just about quiet beauty or the freedom of the open road. There's a weight here, a presence you can feel if you let yourself. And sometimes, even when you leave, it leaves a mark, not just on your camper, but on you. I tried to tell myself that the forest had no memory, that the handprint was nothing more than a trick of condensation, a fleeting smear from a stray branch, maybe even the imagination playing cruel games in the half-light of night. But every mile I drove away from the campsite, that memory clung tighter, pressing against my thoughts like a shadow that refused to be outrun. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lingering there, a phantom figure in the reflection of the Volkswagen's rear glass. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, my breath shallow, but I kept going because the alternative, staying and confronting whatever it was, felt unbearable. Hours later, I found a small diner along Highway 68. The fluorescent lights were harsh and unforgiving, the clatter of dishes and low murmur of voices grounding in a way that felt almost sacred after the night I'd endured. I tried to explain to the waitress what had happened, only to choke on the words, realizing I didn't even fully understand it myself. She smiled politely and asked if I'd like coffee. I nodded, sipped, and watched as the sunlight grew stronger, cutting through the haze that clung to the edges of my mind. Rationality demanded it, demanded I label what I'd experienced as an overactive imagination, exhaustion, or a combination of both. And yet, a part of me knew better. By the time I reached the next campground, the unease hadn't left. Even in the full light of day, the trees seemed to lean a little too close, their branches whispering with voices I couldn't quite place. I parked the VW, tried to distract myself with routine tasks, checking the water lines, adjusting the level, fixing a loose latch. But my fingers kept brushing over the rear window, tracing the smooth glass that had once borne the handprint. Each touch sent a shiver down my spine, a subtle reminder that the forest had not released me, and maybe never would. Later that afternoon, I took a walk along the edge of the lake, hoping the sun and gentle lapping of water would soothe the nerves that still trembled beneath my skin. The reflections on the surface were mesmerizing, almost hypnotic until I saw it, ripples in the water that didn't match the wind, patterns like fingertips pressed just beneath the surface. My stomach twisted and I stumbled back a step, heart hammering. Rationally, it could have been fish, wind, floating debris, but my gut told me differently. I could feel it then, a tension pressing against me from all sides, a forest alive in ways I couldn't name. I returned to the VW, the sunlight fading faster than I expected, and found myself hesitating at the door, hand hovering over the handle. My mind replayed the night over and over, each detail sharpening, the shape of the fingers, the smear of mud, the way the forest fell silent in anticipation. And then I saw movement, just for a moment at the corner of my vision. A shadow, crouched low, slipping behind a tree, vanishing before I could even blink. Panic flared in my chest. My rational mind wanted to dismiss it, wanted to claim it was a trick of light, an animal, a memory projected onto reality. But my instincts screamed. It had been watching. It still was. I decided to leave immediately, packing with shaking hands, the generator roaring to life as I shoved items into the camper. The drive back along the gravel road felt endless. Each bend revealed trees that seemed to inch closer, their roots clawing into the earth, their leaves rustling with hidden voices. I kept glancing back at the rear window, half expecting that handprint to reappear, that long, thin hand to press itself again against the glass, demanding attention, reminding me of a presence that refused to be ignored. At one point, I stopped the VW, heart hammering, unable to continue. The quiet of the forest pressed against the metal walls like it had somehow followed me. I turned on the flashlight, scanned the trees, the underbrush, the road behind me. Nothing. And yet, the dread remained, a suffocating weight that made it impossible to breathe normally. I realized then that it wasn't just about the handprint. It was about the message it carried. The wilderness was alive in ways we think we understand, and sometimes it leaves reminders, subtle but undeniable, that you are not alone. By the time I finally reached the highway, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and red. The road stretched ahead, endless and empty, and the fear that had gripped me so tightly began to loosen, though it never fully left. Even in the safety of the open road, the handprint lingered in my mind, a psychological scar that refused to fade. I thought about the campers who had come before me, the stories whispered around campfires, the warnings ignored. The forest doesn't forgive mistakes, and it doesn't reveal itself entirely. It tests you. It marks you. And if you are careless, it follows. That night, as I parked at a familiar RV park far from Land Between the Lakes, I sat in the VW long after the generator had stopped humming. I traced the glass with my fingertips again, half hoping, half dreading to find the handprint returned. There was nothing, just the cold, hard reflection of myself staring back. But I knew the memory was enough. The forest had left its mark in a way I couldn't wash away, in a way that would shape every future camping trip. I had learned, painfully, that there are forces in the woods that can't be rationalized away, that fear is sometimes the only evidence of truth. When I finally drifted into sleep, it was uneasy, filled with half-dreams of hands pressing against glass, of trees bending closer, of shadows that were just a little too alive. And when I woke, the memory of that night was as vivid as ever. I understood then that the wilderness demands respect, vigilance, and humility. It offers beauty and freedom, yes, but it also teaches lessons the hard way, lessons that leave marks on your soul long after you've left the campsite behind. Even now, years later, I can't drive past Land Between the Lakes without a shiver creeping along my spine. The memory of that handprint, the deliberate, human-like smear on the back window of my Volkswagen, reminds me that the world is bigger, darker, and far stranger than we allow ourselves to believe. And sometimes, the quietest moments in the woods are the most dangerous, because what you don't see is often watching, waiting, and remembering.